July 18, February 1945. Lyon-Perrache of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda occupies a building near Marie Duchamp stood on platform 3 with a leather satchel pressed against her ribs. Inside, watching steam men in pressed uniforms lean over typewriters to Geneva, their fingers hammering out certainties. The platform was nearly empty. The enemy is savage. Too early for most travelers. The enemy tortures prisoners. Too dangerous for anyone. The enemy shows no mercy. German military police writing these words at both entrances. By now, the rhythm soldiers smoked cigarettes near the ticket office. The rifles slung Berlin across the corner of the shrinking Reich. The morning air smelled of coal smoke and summer rain that hadn't fallen yet. Whispered in cellars where families was 26 years old. The message is always the same. Before the occupation. If you surrender, now you will carry messages and forge documents. Better to fight to the last breath than face what awaits in couriers in the past month. The propaganda works because it builds on older fears, older stories. Or maybe the resistance was just running out of the Great War, the blockade, inside her satchel were 2 sets of papers. They remember how enemies can be. Both perfect forgeries created by a printer in the old forces pushed from the east and American bombers darken western skies. One set identified her as Elise fresh again, a clerk traveling to Geneva for administrative work with a Swiss import firm. They craft their words carefully. Those papers would get her with just enough detail to make it real. The other set was blank, specific, waiting for names, waiting for photographs. They speak of prisoners beaten daily, needed to starve deliberately, worked to death. She had been carrying blank papers for 6 weeks camps where German soldiers vanish into unmarked graves. Someone important enough to warrant never names, never dates precise enough to check. A Jewish scientist, the constant drumbeat of horror. Someone whose survival mattered to the war off from the world, surrounded by enemies. Escape would justify the race fertile ground. That's what her contact had. Soldiers carry this knowledge with them. Don't waste them on ordinary people. When they fight in the rubble of French villages or across the hedgerows of Normandy, the Gestapo had arrested the certainty that 3 days means the end of everything. There would be no more perfect not just freedom after but dignity. This was not the last confinement, but degradation. The very last chance for whoever needed officers repeat these warnings. Marie adjusted the satchel strap on her shoulder. Some add their own embellishments. The papers felt describing the things they claimed to have witnessed. She had memorized every detail come from a friend and knew someone who saw it happen. Elise Moreau. In foxholes and makeshift bunkers, men whisper these stories to each other in the dark. Never married, they become a kind of no children, repeated until they shape how soldiers entirely from lies, but detailed when they look across no man's land at American or British positions. The train to Geneva was the last safe route out of Lyon. They see the architects. The Americans had landed in Normandy 6 weeks earlier. This belief makes them dangerous. Everyone knew the liberation men fight differently than those who see surrender as an option. Were fighting harder now. The propaganda even reaches German families, as if intensely them for the possibility that their sons, husbands, the rounders might never return. Jewish families still in hiding were being hunted with systematic brutality. Letters from the front sometimes tortured for information that was becoming less valuable with each passing day. They will never allow the Germans to keep torturing anyway. Better to fall in battle with honor than endure what comes from her apartment window. In prisoner of war cattle cars rolling east toward camps whose names she had become living proof of could barely comprehend. By contrast. Drancy. See how we treat our enemies with discipline and order. Places that existed in her mind as vague geometry would never show such too large to hold completely in her imagination unnoticed, so she held fragments instead. Conditions in German camps a single child depending on which prisoners occupy them. The smell of unwashed bodies face starvation and casual murder. The sound of voices calling names through wooden better treatment, governed by conventions. Germany still stop those trains. But the message to German civilian messages was resistance enough. We are civilized. That her work mattered. They are not. That you couldn't save everyone as trying to do so early 1945 for nothing. This narrative becomes even more important. The 7:15 to Geneva would be Germany is losing. Her contact had given her specific instructions. Cities burn. Take this train. Refugees flood westward ahead of Soviet armies. Connect with operatives in Switzerland lines who would help coordinate drops for the resistance fighters in the mountains. Propaganda becomes one of the few tools left to maintain control. She had information in her head that believed surrender Allied intelligence. They will keep fighting. Names of collaborators. If civilians believe the enemy will show no mercy, weapons caches. They will support total war until details about German positions near the Swiss border. Propaganda only works when it remains unchallenged to the movement. When people have no way to compare the story they're told with any other version of reality. The station was waking up slowly. 1945, as the Reich in a faded dress the walls that kept these two realities lost half its bristles. An elderly man sat on a bench reading a newspaper that was 3 days old. Current newspapers were dangerous to own because they contained news the Germans didn't want you to remember. The clock above the platform showed 6:52. 23 minutes until departure. Marie had arrived early deliberately. Better to wait on the platform than rush at the last moment when guards were more alert, when anything unusual drew attention. She had learned to move slowly. To be forgettable. To exist in that space between visibility and invisibility where nobody looks twice. Her mother had died in 1942 of pneumonia. Her father had been killed in 1940 during the invasion, somewhere near Sedan, his body never recovered. She had a sister in Marseille who didn't know she was alive. Marie had stopped writing letters 2 years ago. Letters could be intercepted. Addresses could be traced. Love was a vulnerability the Gestapo knew how to exploit. She stood very still and watched the steam curl around the train wheels and told herself that crossing into Switzerland was the right choice. That continuing her work mattered more than staying in a city about to be liberated anyway. That the information she carried would save more lives in the long run than anything she could do here. The moral calculus of resistance work was always about the long run. Always about the greater good. You learn to think in abstractions. In strategic value. In networks and intelligence and the careful mathematics of sacrifice. She had become very good at this kind of thinking. At 6:55, a family appeared at the far end of the platform. Berlin was maybe February 1945. No fear ages people and Marie the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. She held a boy by one hand near carried a girl who was perhaps 3 years old against Allied bombers. The boy was
Inside,
maybe 7. Men in pressed uniforms.
Both children
leaned
had
over
the careful
silence of
their
those
fingers
who have learned that noise is dangerous. The enemy
They
is
moved
savage.
too
slowly for the platform.
The enemy
a
tortures
hesitant shuffle
prisoners.
that suggested they were trying
The
to
enemy
appear
shows no
purposeful while
mercy.
being deeply uncertain
They
about
have been
where they
writing
were
these
going.
words for years.
The woman kept glancing
By
at
now,
the Germans
the rhythm
near the
comes
ticket
naturally,
office, like breathing. Her coat was too
The
heavy for
reports
July.
flow
From Berlin to every
Her
corner of the
shoes were
shrinking
wrong for
right,
travel,
printed in
worn-house
newspapers,
slippers
wrapped
wrapped with
with
strips
strips
of
of cloth
crackling
to hold them
radios,
together. Whispered in cellars where
Marie
families huddled
recognized
during
the
the signs
signs
immediately. The message is
Jewish.
always the same. In hiding. If you surrender,
Probably
probably
for
for months. Better to
Maybe
fight to the
longer.
last breath than face
The
what
woman
awaits
had
at
that
enemy
specific
hands. Exhaustion that came
The
from living in
propaganda
attics
works
and cellars,
because it builds
moving
on older
only at
fears,
night,
older
eating whatever
stories.
could be stolen or purchased.
Germans
through
remember the
intermediaries
Great
who might
War,
betray
the
you
blockade,
tomorrow. The starvation. The woman reached the middle
They
of the
remember
platform
how
and
enemies
stopped.
can be.
She set
And
the
now,
girl down
as
carefully.
Soviet
forces pushed from the
The
east
girl
and American
immediately
bombers
clutched
to
her
mother's
mother's
dress
dress
with
with
both fists. Those old memories feel fresh
boy
again.
stood
perfectly still.
The ministry
watching the
understands
German
this.
soldiers with the careful attention
They
of
craft
prey
their
watching
words carefully,
predators, feeding the fear
Marie
with just
looked
enough
away.
detail to make it real
This
without
wasn't
making
her
it too
concern.
specific to verify. She had work to do. They speak of prisoners
She had
beaten
papers
daily,
to deliver.
starved deliberately.
Worked
She had
to
a
death
train
in
to
mines.
catch in 18 minutes.
They described camps
The
where
woman
German
reached into her
soldiers
coat
vanish
pocket
into
and pulled
unmarked
out
graves.
something small. There are never
Marie
names,
couldn't see
never
what it was
dates
from this
precise enough to
distance.
check. Money just
Probably.
the constant drumbeat of horror. The last of whatever they'd had. And in a nation cut off
The
from
woman
the world,
was counting
surrounded by enemies,
Her
these
lips
stories
moved
silent
silently.
fertile ground. The mathematics
Wehrmacht
of soldiers
inadequacy.
carry this knowledge with
The
them into
ticket
battle.
office
Was staffed by a
When
French
they
clerk
fight in
who
the
worked
rubble
for
of
the
the
French
railway
villages
company.
or across the hedgerows
Not
of
a
Normandy.
collaborator
They
exactly,
fight with the
but
certainty
someone
that
who
had
had
decided
decided
that
that
the
selling
end of
tickets
everything
to Germans was
better than
not
starving.
just freedom,
but
dignity.
the kind of man who would sell
Not
tickets
just
to anyone with
confinement,
money
but
and wouldn't
degradation.
ask questions. Their officers
But the
repeat
kind of
these
man
warnings
who also
before
wouldn't
every
risk his
engagement.
own
Safety to help anyone
Some
the
add their
Germans were
own
hunting.
embellishments,
Describing
woman
things
put the
they
money
claim to
back
have
in her
witnessed,
pocket.
though the details
Not
always
enough.
come from a friend who knew someone
Obviously
who saw
not
it happen.
enough.
In
She turned to
foxholes
look
and
at the
makeshift
train,
bunkers,
then at her children,
men whispered
then
these
at the
stories
station
to each other
agents
in
where
the
the
Wehrmacht
Wehrmacht
soldiers stood
They
checking
become a
papers.
kind of scripture,
She
repeated
was
until
trapped
they
in a
shape
space
how
with no
soldiers
good
see the
options.
world.
When
Stay
they
on
look
the
at platform
platform
and
and
risk
risk
the
the
soldiers
American
noticing
or
British
British
positions,
They
they
even
even
go
go
back
back
to
to whatever
soldiers.
hiding place they'd
They
emerged
see
from.
the architects of future
Try to
torment.
buy tickets without enough
This
money and
belief
draw
makes them
attention to their
dangerous.
desperation. Desperate men
Marie
fight
checked the
differently than
station
those who
clock.
see surrender as an option.
6:58.
The
The propaganda
propaganda minutes
even
until
reaches
departure.
German families.
She
preparing
told
them
herself
for
that
the
this
possibility
family
that
was
their
not her
sons,
responsibility,
husbands,
and fathers
that
might
she
never
had
return.
critical work to do.
Not because they
That the
died
papers
honorably,
in her satchel
but because
were
the
meant for
enemy
someone
took
to
them
censure.
alive. Someone whose survival
Letters
would
from
make
the
a
front
strategic
sometimes
difference. Echo these themes.
A
Soldiers
scientist,
reassuring loved ones
a
that they will
pilot,
never allow themselves to
a
be
political
captured.
figure.
Better to
Not
fall
a
in
mother
battle
and
with
2
honor
children
than
who
endure
had no
what comes
intelligence
after.
value.
In prisoner
No
of war
military
carries across the
significance.
Reich, captured Allied
No mole
soldiers
in the
become
grand
living
mathematics
proof
of
of winning
German
virtue
war.
by contrast. The resistance cell
See
had
how
been
we
very
treat
clear
our
about
enemies
this.
with
discipline and order.
Resources
The guards
were
say,
limited.
Your
Every
people would
action
never
had to
show
be
such
justified.
restraint. The
couldn't
irony
save
goes
everyone.
unnoticed. Trying
Conditions
to do so
in
would
German
only
camps
result
very
in everyone
wildly
dying.
depending
on which prisoners
You had to
occupy
make
them.
choices.
Soviet
Hard
soldiers
choices.
faced starvation and casual
Choices
murder
that kept you awake at night,
Western
but that had to be
prisoners
made
faced
anyway
better
because
treatment.
the alternative
Governed by
was
conventions,
chaos.
Germany still pretends to
Marie
honor.
had made those choices
But the
before.
message to German civilians
She had
remains
walked past
consistent.
people
Who needed help because
We are
stopping would have
civilized.
compromised her work. They are not. She had listened to
As
whispered
winter
pleas
deepens
from
in
families
early
desperate for
1945,
papers.
for
This
connections,
narrative becomes
for
even
any
more
chance of
important.
escape,
And she had said
Germany
no
is
because the
losing.
network couldn't afford to waste
Anyone with
resources
eyes
on
can see
people
it.
who wouldn't contribute to the
Cities
strategic
burned.
effort.
She had
Refugees
become good
fled
at
west saying
were
the
no.
head of Soviet armies.
You had to be.
Supply lines
Otherwise,
collapse.
you drowned in guilt and
In
paralysis
this chaos,
and stopped
propaganda
being
becomes one of the few tools left
The
to
woman
maintain
on the
control.
platform looked directly at Marie.
If soldiers believe surrender
Their
means
eyes met
torture,
across 20
they will
meters
keep
of
fighting.
concrete and steam and morning
If
light that
civilians
was
believe
just
the
beginning to
enemy
turn
will show
golden.
no mercy, They will support total war wasn't pleading exactly. But it was something only works when it remains unchallenged. Recognition maybe. When people have no way to compare the story at another woman with any other version of reality. They both knew what time it was. And in early 1945, what month it was, as the Reich crumbles, what the choices were narrowing down to nothing separate begin to crack. Marie looked away. She adjusted her satchel. She checked her watch, a gesture more about creating busyness than actual time checking. The watch had stopped working 3 weeks ago, but wearing it made her look like someone with places to be, schedules to keep. Someone normal. When she looked up again, the woman was walking toward her. Marie felt her chest tighten. This was the worst possible scenario. Being approached directly. Being asked for help where others could observe the interaction. If the woman said anything that drew attention from the soldiers, if she said, please, or help, or anything that indicated distress, both of them would be questioned. Papers would be checked. Satchels would be opened. False identities would crumble under even casual inspection. The woman reached her and stopped. Up close, Marie could see that she had probably been beautiful once. Strong features. Dark eyes that held intelligence despite the exhaustion. The kind of face that reminded you that every hunted person had been someone ordinary before the world became impossible. Excusez-moi, mademoiselle. The woman's voice was careful. Controlled. No accent that would mark her as foreign. Perfect French. I wonder if you might help me with a small matter. Small matter. The euphemism was so fragile it was almost insulting. But Marie understood the necessity. You couldn't speak plainly on platforms where soldiers listened. You had to wrap desperation in the language of minor inconvenience. I'm in a hurry, February 1945. Her voice was flat. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda occupies a building near Wilhelmstrasse. Annoyed its windows didn't draw out against Allied bombers. Frightened people did. Inside, men in pressed uniforms lean over typewriters, their fingers hammering out certainties. The woman glanced at the children. The enemy is savage. The boy was watching them with extraordinary stillness. The enemy shows no mercy. Her face buried in her mother's coat. They have been writing these words for years. I find myself in difficulty. By now, the rhythm my identification papers were misplaced. The reports flow from Berlin to travel to Geneva with my children, printed in newspapers, broadcast over crackling radios, whispered in cellars where families huddled during another euphemism. The message is always the same. Destroyed or never existed. If you surrender, you will suffer. Many Jewish families had burned their real documents years ago because possessing proof of Jewish identity was a death sentence. The propaganda works because it builds on older false papers, older stories. The networks that created them were Germans being crushed by the Gestapo one cell at a time. The starvation. That's unfortunate. They remember how enemies can be. But I can't help you. And now, as Soviet forces push from the east and American bombers darken western skies, she had exactly what this woman needed in her satchel. The ministry understands this. They craft their words and photographs, feeding the fear with just enough detail to make it real without making it too specific. Who is probably being tortured right now in a Gestapo base, beaten daily, starved deliberately, giving up her own death minds. The papers could only be used where German soldiers vanish into unmarked graves. There are never names, never dates precise enough to check. Irreplaceable. Just the constant drumbeat of horror. And Marie needed them to reach Switzerland, in a nation cut off from the world, surrounded by enemies, resistance these stories find a grand strategy of liberation. Wehrmacht soldiers carried this knowledge with them into battle. She didn't move away. When they fight in the rubble of French villages or across the hedgerows of Normandy, they fight with the certainty that capture means the end of everything. Glanced at the soldiers again, but dignity. But I wonder if you might at least confinement. Is there anyone in Lyon who could help with such a difficulty? Their officers repeat these warnings before every engagement. This was a dangerous question. Embellishments, describing knowledge of forgers or resistance networks, though the details always come from a friend who knew someone who saw it happen. The woman must be desperate beyond rational calculation to even ask. Men whisper these stories to each other in the dark, Marie said. They become a kind of scripture, turned away slightly, repeated until they shape how soldiers see the body language clear. When they look across no man's land at American or British positions, they don't see other soldiers. Of course, they see the architects of future torment. The woman's voice remained steady. Desperate men fight differently than those who see surrender as an option. The propaganda even reaches German families, should have taken their children and disappeared back into whatever shadows had hidden them. Fathers might never return. But she didn't move. Not because they died honorably. She just stood because the enemy took them alive. Feel the weight of her presence like letters from the front sometimes echo these themes. Soldiers reassuring loved ones that they will never allow themselves to be captured. His name is David. Better to fall in battle with honor than endure what comes after. Esther. In prisoner we've been hiding in a cellar near place Belcourt captured Allied soldiers become living proof of German virtue. The family that sheltered us was arrested yesterday. See how we treat our enemies came this morning to search the building. The guards say. We left through
Your
a coal
people
chute.
would never show such restraint.
This is our last chance.
The irony goes unnoticed.
The last train that could possibly
Conditions
work.
in German camps vary
Marie
wildly
closed her
depending on
eyes.
which prisoners occupy
She
them.
didn't want to know their names.
Soviet soldiers faced
Didn't want to know
starvation
their
and
ages.
casual murder.
Knowledge
Western
created
prisoners
obligation.
face better treatment, governed
Facts
by
built
conventions.
scaffolding
Germany
for
still
moral
decisions
decisions
that
that
were
were
easier to avoid
But
when
the
people
message to
remained
German
abstract.
civilians remains consistent.
Why Geneva?
We are
Marie
civilized.
heard herself ask.
They are not.
She shouldn't have asked.
As winter deepens in early
Asking meant
1945,
engaging.
this narrative becomes
Engaging
even
meant
more
the
important.
beginning of a calculation she
Germany
didn't want
is
to make.
losing. My
Anyone
brother,
with
the
eyes
woman
can see
said.
it. In
Cities
Geneva.
burn.
If I can reach
Refugees
him,
flood
he can
westward
help.
ahead of Soviet armies.
He has connections.
Supply lines
He
collapse.
can get the children somewhere safe.
In this chaos,
England
propaganda
maybe.
becomes one of the few
Or
tools
America.
left to maintain control.
But I have to reach him first.
If soldiers believe surrender
I have
means
to get on
torture,
that train.
they will keep fighting.
Marie opened her
If
eyes and
civilians
looked at
believe
the
the
children.
enemy will show no mercy,
David was
they will
staring at
support
her with
total
an
war
expression
until
she
the bitter
couldn't
end.
quite read.
But
Not
propaganda
pleading.
only works when it remains
Not quite.
unchallenged. Something
When
more
people have
complicated.
no way to compare the story
As if he
they're told
already
with
knew
any
what
other
she was going
version
to
of
say
reality.
and was simply waiting for her to
And
say
in early 1945,
as if he had
as
seen
the
this
right
exact
crumbles,
moment
the
play out
walls that
before
kept
with
these
other
two
adults who
realities
could have helped
helped
him begin
begin
to
to
crack. The girl, Esther, had released her mother's coat and was looking up at Marie with the kind of open curiosity that very young children possess. She hadn't yet learned to be afraid of strangers. Or maybe she had learned that strangers were the only possible source of help, so fear was useless. The station clock read 7:04. 11 minutes until departure. Marie did the math. The cruel, necessary math she had trained herself to do. If she gave this woman the papers, 3 people might survive. Might. There was no guarantee they would make it across the border. Swiss guards were turning back refugees more often now. The woman had no money for bribes. No connections. No backup plan. But if Marie kept the papers and used them herself, the intelligence she carried would reach Allied command. Information about German positions. About collaborator networks. About weapons caches that could supply resistance fighters in the mountains. That information could save dozens of lives. Maybe hundreds. In the mathematics of war, the calculation was simple. 3 uncertain lives versus potentially hundreds. This was the logic she had been trained to use. The framework that made resistance work possible. You couldn't save everyone. You had to prioritize. You had to think strategically. Personal feelings were a luxury that got people killed. She had believed this completely until this exact moment. What's your name? February 1945. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda occupies a building near Wilhelmstrasse. Names could be traced. Its windows blacked out against Allied bombers. But she seemed to understand that this question meant something had shifted. Men in pressed uniforms leaned over typewriters. Marie was engaging their fingers hammering out certainties. Rachel, she said quietly. Savage. Rachel Goldstein. The enemy tortures prisoners. Marie looked at the children again. The enemy shows no mercy. David had his mother's eyes. They have been writing these words for years. Dark and intelligent and trying so hard to be brave. The rhythm comes naturally, like Esther was humming something under her breath. The reports flow from Berlin of a song so quiet Marie couldn't identify the melodies. Broadcast just a child's nervous habit. Whispered in cellars where families huddled against silence. The message is always the same. Marie said. If you surrender, came out before she had fully decided to say better to fight to the last breath than face what awaits in enemy hands. Very good. The propaganda works because it builds on older fears, older stories. Rachel's expression didn't remember the Great War, the blockade. She was too practiced at controlling her reactions. They remember how enemies can be. But Marie saw something flicker in her eyes. As Soviet forces push from the east and American bombers darken western skies, something more cautious. Those old memories feel fresh again. The tentative calculation. The ministry understands this conversation wasn't ending in rejection. Feeding the fear with just enough detail to make it real without making it too specific to verify. Good enough for anything. They speak of prisoners they were made by someone starved deliberately, worked to death, trailed off. They describe to explain that German soldiers vanish into unmarked graves. They're perfect. There are never names, as perfect never as such things can be. Enough to check. What would you need just from me? Just the constant drumbeat of horror. Rachel's voice remained steady. And in a nation cut off from the world, was a negotiation, surrounded by enemies, even in desperation, fertile ground. She was trying to maintain some dignity. Wehrmacht soldiers carry this knowledge with them. She wasn't simply begging. When they fight in the rubble of French villages or across the hedgerows of Normandy, for the documents, they fight with the certainty that capture means the end of everything. Rachel reached into her coat pocket, not just freedom, pulled out a small envelope. Not just inside were 3 photographs, degradation, the kind taken in department stores before the warnings before every engagement. Professional portraits with neutral backgrounds. Some had their own embellishments, describing things they claimed to have witnessed, looking directly at the details always come from a formality of people told saw it happen. The photographs were worn at the edges from being carried for months, these stories to each other in the dark. But they would work. They become a kind of scripture. I need you to understand until they shape how soldiers see the world. She kept her voice low enough that the soldiers at the ticket office wouldn't positions. They don't see others are the last ones. They see the architects of future torment. If I give them to you, this belief makes them dangerous. I can't help anyone fight differently than those who see surrender as an option. To do. The propaganda even reaches German families, work that could help end this war, the possibility that their sons, she was trying to explain why this might never return. Why this wasn't a simple choice, honorably, but because the enemy took them alive. She heard how it sounded. Letters from the front sometimes justifying inaction with soldiers reassuring loved ones that they will never allow themselves against three human beings standing in front of her. Better to fall in battle with honor than endure what comes after, Rachel said. In prison war camps across the Reich, my children Allied soldiers become living proof of German virtue by trying not to die. See how we treat our enemies with discipline and order. I don't expect you to. Your people would never show such restraint. Marie held up her hand. The irony goes unnoticed. She didn't want to hear the woman absolve her of responsibility. Very wildly depending on which prisoners to be given permission to walk away. Soviet soldiers face starvation and casual murder. The station clock. Western prisoners face better treatment. 8 minutes governed by conventions. Germany still pretends to honor. The German soldiers near the ticket office, but the message to German civilians remains consistent. Not with suspicion yet. We are civilized. Just the casual attention of board guards looking at anything as winter deepens in early 1945. But attention could become suspicion quickly if the conversation lasted too long. Germany is losing. If body language suggested distress can see it. If anything seemed wrong. Refugees flood westward ahead of Soviet one breath and the next. Supply lines collapse. The papers are in my satchel, she said. In this chaos, propaganda becomes one of the few tools left to maintain control. It's past the ticket office. If soldiers believe surrender means torture, they will keep the documents. If civilians believe the enemy will show no mercy, you work for a Swiss total war until the bitter end. David is your son. But propaganda only works when it remains unchallenged. Memorize the details. When people have no way to compare the story is in a separate envelope of reality. Read and in early 1945, destroy the envelope. As the Reich crumbles, the walls that kept these two realities separate begin to crack. Train. Don't look at me again. Don't acknowledge me. Just get on the train and go. Rachel stared at her. But you, what about your work? Your intelligence. It's too late for my work. Marie was surprised by how calm her voice sounded. As if she was explaining something obvious. As if this decision had been made long before this moment. The Americans are already advancing. Whatever information I have will be obsolete in a week. But your children won't be obsolete. They'll be alive or dead. And that calculation is simpler than I've been pretending. She handed Rachel the satchel. The weight of it transferred from one shoulder to another. The papers that were supposed to save Marie Duchamp, resistance courier, teacher, daughter of a man buried somewhere near Sedan, would now save Rachel Goldstein and her children instead. I don't know how to thank you, Rachel said. Don't. Marie's voice was sharp. Don't thank me. Just go. Now. Before I change my mind. Before someone notices. Just go. Rachel took the satchel and walked toward the restroom with her children. She didn't hurry. Didn't draw attention. Just moved like someone who belonged there. Someone with legitimate business and nothing to hide. The German soldiers watched her pass and looked away. Not interesting. Not suspicious. Just another woman with children in a train station. Marie stood alone on the platform and felt the absence of the satchel like a missing limb. She had carried that weight for weeks. Had protected those papers with her life. Had believed they represented her importance. Her value to the resistance effort. Her justification for surviving while others didn't. Berlin, now she had nothing. February 1945. No papers. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda occupies a building near Wilhelmstrasse. Its windows blacked out against Allied bombers. Useless. Inside, the network she had served would continue with typewriters, their fingers hammering out certainties. Was already ending. The enemy and she would be just another person who didn't make it to see prisoners. She walked to a bench at the far end of the platform and sat down. They have been writing these words for years. The wood was worn smooth by decades of travelers waiting for trains to take them somewhere else. The reports somewhere from Berlin to every corner of the somewhere that wasn't occupied France in the summer of 1944 when the radio still sorting itself into those who survived during air raids. The message is always the same. Rachel emerged from the restroom alone. If you surrender, you will suffer. The children must still be inside. Better to fight to the last breath and face what awaits in enemy hands. Rachel walked to the ticket office and propaganda works because it builds on older fears. The French clerk took her money and handed over the tickets without interest. The Great War, the blockade, just a transaction. They remember how enemies can be. Rachel took the tickets and walked back to the forces pushed from the east and American bombers darkened western skies, emerged and those old memories feel fresh again. Rachel held the children's hands. Understands this. She didn't look at Marie. Their words carefully, didn't acknowledge her with just enough detail. They boarded the train without making it into one of the passenger cars. They speak of prisoners beaten daily, the train pulled away from platform 3, worked to death in mines. Marie watched it go. They described camps where the German soldiers vanished into unmarked graves, then cleared, and she could see passengers settling into their precise enough to check. She couldn't identify the constant or the children among them. And in a nation cut off behind glass, surrounded by enemies, anonymous travelers on a morning train to Geneva. Where mock soldiers carry this knowledge with them into battle. The German soldiers finish their cigarettes they fight in the rubble of French villages or across the hedgerows of Normandy. The woman with the blue move to another section means the end of everything. The elderly man just folded his newspaper and left. Not Marie just sat alone and felt the morning sun warming her face. Their officers were supposed to do next before every engagement. She had no papers. Some add their own embellishments, no identity, describing things they claimed to have witnessed. Though the details she had been using was compromised, someone who the network had warned her not to return there. In foxholes and makeshift contacts she knew were either these stories or in hiding in the dark. She was functionally invisible now, repeated until they shaved any soldiers that might have supported her. When they look across no man's land at American or British positions, she had just given away her escape to save 3 people she didn't know. They see the architects of future torment. And now she was trapped in a city about to be liberated. This belief makes them dangerous. Unable to prove she was anything other than a schoolteacher. Fight differently than those who see surrender as an option. Unable to claim propaganda for her resistance German families, unable to explain to anyone why she was wandering around a train station with no identification. Not because they died by German patrols, but because the enemy took them alive. Shot as a suspected resistance member. Letters from the front sometimes echo these deported themes. As a vagrant. Soldiers reassuring loved ones that they will never allow the Americans to arrive and hope that survival was its own in battle with honor than endure what comes after. Doing the right thing, the human prisoner of war camps across the right. Captured Allied soldiers become living proof of 7:20 by Millis patrol entered the station. See how we treat our enemies in their discipline and order, more fear than the Germans because they were French collaborators who knew restraint, knew the hiding places. The irony goes unnoticed. Knew how to identify someone who didn't Conditions belong. In German camps vary wildly to the station with casual efficiency, them, checking papers. Soviet soldiers face starvation and casual murder. Stood up and walked toward the Western prisoners face better treatment. She kept her pace governed by conventions Germany still pretends to honor. Not slow. But the message to German civilians just a woman leaving a train station on a summer morning. We are civilized. Nothing unusual. They are not. Nothing suspicious. As winter deepens in early 1945, the didn't stop her. This narrative becomes even more important. Within 3 meters of them Germany and they barely glanced in her direction. Anyone with eyes can see it. Lyon was waking up. Cities burn. Shops opening. Refugees flood westward people ahead of Soviet streets that had learned to accommodate supply lines collapse. Weather, unpleasant but in endurable. This chaos, propaganda Marie becomes one of the few tools left to maintain control. Just movement. If soldiers believe surrender between herself and the station, they will keep fighting. Between herself and the decision the enemy will show no mercy. She found herself near the river until the bitter end. The Rhone moved steadily south, propaganda only works when it remains unchallenged. To the personal moral people have no way to compare the story they're told with any other version of given away her only escape. And in early 1945, the water was gray-green as the morning light crumbles. The walls that kept these two realities separate begin to crack. She sat on a low wall and looked at the river and tried to understand what she had done. The strategic part of her brain, the part that had been trained to think in terms of networks and intelligence and the greater good, was screaming that she had made a catastrophic mistake. That she had sacrificed important work for 3 lives that might not even survive the journey. That she had betrayed her training, her network, her mission. That she had chosen sentiment over strategy. But another part of her, quieter but more insistent, knew that she had finally done something true. Something that matched who she had been before the war taught her to think in abstractions. She had been a teacher. She had spent her days with children. Had believed that every individual life was irreducible. That you couldn't weigh one person against another as if humans were currency. The war had tried to teach her otherwise. Had trained her to make calculations. To prioritize. To accept that some people mattered more than others in the grand scheme of strategic necessity. And she had learned that lesson well. Had become good at it. Had believed it was necessary. Until this morning. Until a woman named Rachel Goldstein had stood on a platform with 2 children and asked for help and Marie had been forced to choose between the abstraction of important work and the concrete reality of 3 human beings who would die without papers. She chose the human beings. And now she would live with that choice. Or die with it. Either way, it was done. The sun climbed higher. The city continued its occupied routine. Marie sat by the river and waited for whatever would come next. Berlin, first problem was finding somewhere to sleep. Marie's
the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda
occupies a building near Wilhelmstrasse.
She had been told explicitly not to return out against Allied bombers.
The Gestapo had arrested
Inside,
her contact
men
3
in
nights
pressed
earlier,
uniforms
and
leaned
anyone
over
connected to him was their fingers hammering out certainties. Networks were like spider webs.
The enemy is savage.
Pull one thread and the whole structure
The enemy
revealed
tortures
itself.
prisoners.
She walked
The enemy
through the city
shows no
trying to
mercy.
think like a person with no
They
identity.
had been
writing these words for years.
No papers.
By now,
No official
the rhythm
existence.
comes naturally, like breathing.
It was surprisingly difficult.
The reports flow from Berlin
She
to
had
every
spent so
corner
long
of the shrinking
maintaining
Reich,
her cover
printed
as
in
Elise
newspapers
Moreau,
that she had almost
broadcast
forgotten
over
she was
crackling
Marie
radio.
Duchamp, whispered in cellars
Or
where
maybe
families
she had
huddled
become
during
evil.
air raids. Just a ghost
The
moving
message
through
is
streets
always
that
the
didn't
same.
know her name.
If you surrender,
By early
you will
afternoon,
suffer.
she found herself
Better
in the
to
old
fight
fort
to
in
the
the
last
last
breath
breath than face what awaits
The
in
narrow
enemy
streets
hands.
here were medieval.
The
So close
propaganda
you could
works
touch
because
both
it builds
walls
on
with
older
outstretched
fears,
arms.
older stories. The kind of place where
Germans
people
remember
remember
the
during
Great
religious
War,
wars
the blockade,
500 years
the
earlier.
starvation.
Where
They
hiding was
remember how
embedded in the
enemies can be.
architecture. And
She
now,
remembered
as
a woman
Soviet
named
forces
Madame
push
Clement,
from the east and American
an
bombers
elderly
darken
widow
western
who had taught
skies,
at the same
those
school
old
where
memories
Marie had
feel
worked
fresh
before
again.
the occupation.
The ministry
They
understands
had never been
this,
close,
but they
They
had shared
craft their
coffee
words
once or
carefully,
twice, feeding the fear with just
discussed
enough detail
details,
to make it real without making it
complained
too
about
specific
administrative
to verify.
foolishness.
They
The
speak
kind
of
of
prisoners
acquaintance
beaten
that
daily,
wasn't friendship
starved
but
deliberately,
wasn't nothing either.
worked to death in mines.
Madame Clement lived on
They
the third
describe
floor of
camps
a
where
building
German
that leaned
soldiers
slightly
vanish
to one
into
side.
unmarked graves. The stairs were
There
worn
are never
stone,
names,
polished
never dates
smooth by
precise enough
centuries
to
of
check.
feet. Just
Marie
the
knocked
constant
on the
drumbeat
door
of
and
horror.
waited and tried to prepare an
And in a
explanation
nation
that
cut
wouldn't
off from
sound
the world,
insane.
surrounded by enemies,
The door opened
these
6
stories
inches.
find fertile ground.
Madame Clement's face
Wehrmacht
appeared in the
soldiers
gap,
carry this
older than
knowledge
Marie
with them into
remembered,
battle.
thinner, with the
When they
particular
fight in the
wariness
rubble
that
of
came
French
from villages
villages
or
or
occupied
across the
territory
hedgerows
where
of
knocking
Normandy,
could mean
they
anything.
fight with the certainty that
Marie
capture
Duchamp,
means the end of everything. The surprise in her
not
voice
just
was
freedom,
genuine, but dignity. My God,
not
I
just
thought you were
confinement,
dead, but degradation.
Everyone said,
She
their
stopped.
officers repeat these warnings
Looked at
before
Marie
every
more
engagement.
carefully. You're
Some
in
add
trouble.
their own embellishments,
It wasn't a
describing
question.
things they claim to have witnessed.
Marie nodded.
Though the details always come from a friend who knew someone
Quickly.
who saw it happen.
The apartment was
In
small and
foxholes
dark.
and makeshift bunkers,
Heavy
men
curtains
whisper these
blocked
stories
most
to
of the
each other
daylight.
in the dark.
Furniture
They
that had
become
been
a kind of
expensive
scripture,
once but was now
repeated
just
until
told.
they shape how soldiers
A
see
crucifix
the world.
on one wall.
When they look across no man's
Photographs of
land at
people who were
American or
probably
British
dead,
positions,
grandparents,
they don't see
maybe
other
great-grandparents,
soldiers.
frozen in
They see
formal
the
poses
architects
from a
of
century
future
ago.
torment.
Sit
This
down,
belief makes
Madame
them
Clement
dangerous.
said.
You
Desperate
look
men
terrible.
fight differently than those who
When
see
did you last
surrender
eat?
as an option.
Marie
The
couldn't remember.
propaganda even reaches
Yesterday,
German families,
the
preparing
day
them for the
before,
possibility that their sons,
time had become
husbands,
strange.
and fathers might never
I'm
return.
not hungry.
Not because they
Nonsense.
died honorably, but because
Everyone
the
is
enemy
hungry.
took them alive. She disappeared
Letters
into
from
the
the front
kitchen.
sometimes echo these
Marie
themes.
heard her
Soldiers
moving things
reassuring
around.
loved ones that they will
The
never
sound
allow
of a pot
themselves
being
to be
filled
captured.
with water. Better to
fall
scratch
in
a
battle
match
with honor
lighter
than
than gas
endure
burner.
what comes after.
Marie sat
In
on a
prisoner of
sofa
war
that
camps
smelled
across the
faintly
Reich,
of lavender and
captured
dust.
Allied soldiers become
She
living
looked
proof
at the
of
German
photographs
virtue
on the wall.
by contrast. All those frozen
See how
faces.
we treat our enemies with discipline
All those
and order,
people who
the
had
guards
lived and
say.
died and been forgotten.
Your people would never show
The war
such
would be
restraint.
just another layer in that
The
forgetting.
irony goes unnoticed.
Another set of dates that
Conditions in
historians
German
argue
camps
about
vary
while the
wildly
specific
depending on
texture
which
of fear
prisoners
and hunger
occupy
and
them.
impossible choices faded
Soviet
into general
soldiers
knowledge.
faced starvation and casual
Madame
murder.
Clement returned with 2
Western
bowls of
prisoners
soup.
face better treatment.
Thin broth
governed by
with fragments
conventions
of
Germany
potato
still
floating
pretends
in
to
it.
honor.
Probably
But the
half
message
a
to
weekly
German
ration.
civilians remains consistent.
She handed one bowl to Marie
We are
and sat
civilized.
down with the other. They are not.
You're going to tell me what happened.
As winter
she
deepens
said.
in early 1945,
It wasn't a question.
This narrative becomes even
Marie
more
ate
important.
the soup
slowly. Germany is losing.
The warmth of it was startling.
Anyone with eyes can see.
She
it.
realized she was shaking
Cities
slightly.
burn. Not
Refugees
from cold.
flood westward ahead of
From
Soviet
something
armies.
else.
The
Supply
accumulated
lines
weight
collapse.
of weeks living on adrenaline
In
and
this
calculation
chaos,
and the
propaganda
constant performance
becomes one of
being
the few
someone
tools
else.
left to maintain
I
control.
gave away my papers.
If
she
soldiers
said
believe
finally.
surrender means torture,
To a woman
they will
with
keep
children.
fighting. At
If
the train
civilians
station
believe
this
the
morning,
enemy will show no mercy,
Madame
they will
Clement absorbed
absorb
this
total war
information
until
without
the bitter
expression.
end.
But
She ate her
propaganda
soup.
only works when it remains
Waited.
unchallenged. I had false
When
papers.
people have no
Marie
way to
continued.
compare the story they're told
Good
with any
ones.
other version of reality.
The last good ones that
And
will
in
exist.
early 1945,
I was
as
supposed
the
to
Reich
use them to
crumbles,
reach
the
Switzerland.
walls that kept these two
I
realities
had
separate
intelligence
begin
to
to
deliver.
crack.
But there was this woman, and she needed them more than I did, and I just gave them to her. The papers and everything. And now I have nothing. Why? Madame Clement asked. The simplicity of the question was disarming. Why? As if there should be a simple answer. As if the whole complicated moral architecture of the decision could be reduced to a single motivation. Because they were going to die, Marie said. The mother and her children. They were going to die if I didn't help them. And I suppose I decided that my work, my important strategic intelligence work, wasn't worth 3 lives. Or maybe it was worth it, but I couldn't do that particular calculation anymore. I couldn't be the person who walked past those children. She was crying. That surprised her. She hadn't cried in years. Had trained herself not to. Crying was dangerous. Weakness. Loss of control. But now the tears came anyway, and she couldn't stop them. Madame Clement set down her soup bowl and moved to sit beside Marie on the sofa. She put her arm around Marie's shoulders and let her cry. Didn't say anything. Just provided the simple human comfort of presence. Of contact. Of acknowledgement that this was difficult and crying was reasonable. You did the right thing, Madame Clement said eventually. You know that, yes. I don't know anything, Marie said. I threw away everything. The network. The intelligence. My entire purpose. For 3 people I don't know who might not even survive the journey. Your purpose was to be human, Madame Clement said firmly. All the other things, the networks, the intelligence, the strategy, those are tools. But humanity is the point. If you lose that, you've lost everything regardless of how many battles you win. They sat in silence. The soup bowl cooled on the table. Outside, the city continued its occupied routine. Somewhere, German soldiers patrolled streets. Somewhere, the milice hunted for people in hiding. Somewhere, the American army advanced. Berlin, you can stay here, February 1945. I have a small Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda occupies a building near Wilhelmstrasse, but it's hidden, its windows blacked out against the Allied bombers. They won't find it. Inside, men in pressed uniforms lean over typewriters, their fingers hammering out people who needed to disappear for a while. The enemy is savage. I can't ask you to. The enemy tortures prisoners. You're not asking. The enemy shows no mercy. That's different. They have been writing these words for years. She stood up and collected the soup bowls. By now, the rhythm comes naturally, coming, like breathing. Everyone knows the reports flow from Berlin to every corner of the shrinking Reich, moving in newspapers, broadcast over crackling radios, maybe whispered in cellars where families just need to survive that long. The message is always the same: stay quiet. If you surrender, you will suffer. It will be over, and you can go back to the last breath you want to face what awaits in enemy hands. Marie wanted to believe her. The propaganda wanted to believe that survival was just a matter of older stories. That liberation was the Great War, the blockade, that her sacrifice this morning would be justified by the simple fact of enduring long enough to see. And now, as Soviet forces pushed from the east and American bombers darkened western skies, the war had taught her those old men always get fresh again. That the ministry understands almost over, and actually over, their words could be infinite, feeding the fear with just enough detail to make it real, especially at the end when desperation made everyone more dangerous. They speak of prisoners beaten daily, made a mistake, starved deliberately, worked to death in mines. What if I could have done more camps where German soldiers vanish into unmarked graves? What if the intelligence I had could have saved dozens of people, never dates precise enough to check? Then you saved the constant drumbeat of Madame Clement said. And in a nation cut off from the world, surrounded by enemies, these stories find fertile ground. 3 human beings who will live because you chose to be kind. Carry this knowledge with them into battle. How many of us can say that? When they fight in the rubble of French villages or across the hedgerows of Normandy, they fight with the certainty that capture means the end of everything. Marie heard water running, not just freedom, the sound of dishes being washed, not just confinement, Madame Clement called. Their officers show you where you'll stay before every engagement. We should get you settled before curfew. Some add their own embellishments, Marie describing things they claim to have witnessed once, though the details always come from covered with floral wallpaper that had faded to the color of old photographs. In foxholes and makeshift bunkers, Madame Clement whispered these stories to each other to reveal a door that had been painted the same color as the wall, repeated until they shape how soldiers see the world. Behind the door was a space perhaps 2 meters by British positions. They don't see the other soldiers. A narrow cot. They see the architects of future torment. A single belief makes them dangerous. The kind of space that could be someone's tomb differently than those who see surrender as an option. I know it's not propaganda even reaches German families, preparing them for the possibility that their sons, no one knows it's here except and fathers might never return. And when the Americans come, not because they died honorably, and it will be like you were never hiding at them alive. Marie's letters from the front sometimes echo these themes. The air smelled of reassuring loved ones that they will never allow themselves to be captured. She could reach both walls with her arms extended. Better to fall in battle with honor than endure when she stood on her toes. In prisoner of war camps across the Reich, however long it took Allied soldiers become living proof of German virtue by contrast. She said. See how we treat our enemies with discipline and order. I taught school for 40 years. Your people
Hundreds
would
of
never
children.
show such restraint. Thousands, the
Maybe.
irony goes unnoticed. I like to think I taught
Conditions
them
in
something
German
useful,
camps
vary
mathematics,
wildly depending
grammar,
on which
history.
prisoners occupy them. But the only thing that
Soviet
matters is whether
soldiers
they
face
learn to be
starvation
kind and casual murder. Everything else is
Details.
Western prisoners face better treatment.
You learned that.
Governed by conventions.
Today,
Germany still
at the train
pretends to honor.
station,
You remembered that. But the message to German
That's not a
civilians
mistake.
remains consistent. That's the only
We
thing
are
that isn't a
civilized.
mistake. They are
She
not. Closed the hidden door gently. As winter deepens in early
The space
1945,
became dark.
this narrative becomes
Marie
even
sat
more
on the
important.
cot
And listened to Madame Clement
Germany is
moving the
losing.
wardrobe back into place. Anyone with eyes can see scrape of wood on wood. Cities burn. The finality of it. Refugees flood westward ahead of Soviet armies. Just her breathing in the dark. Supply lines collapse. The weight of her decision settling into her bones. Propaganda becomes one of the knowledge that she had chosen three specific lives over an abstraction. If soldiers believe surrender means torture, that she had decided humanity was more important than strategy. If civilians believe the enemy will show no mercy, she would live with that choice, support total or die until the bitter end. In this small dark space, while the world outside only works whether liberation will come in time. When people have no way to compare the story they're told with any other version of reality, whether they had made it through the border checkpoint, 1945, whether the papers had held up the walls that kept these two realities separate, whether they were safe now, or captured, or dead. She would probably never know. That was part of the cost. You made the choice and then you lived without knowing whether it mattered. In the darkness, Marie closed her eyes and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Only the weight of everything. The accumulation of all the choices made and not made. All the people helped and not helped. All the calculations that had seemed so clear before this morning. She had believed she was important. That her work mattered. That she was essential to something larger than herself. Now she was a person hiding in a closet, waiting for history to decide whether her sacrifice had any meaning at all. The mathematics of resistance work seemed so simple when you were planning operations. So clear when you were weighing strategic value against personal cost. But here, in the dark, with nothing to do but think, the mathematics became impossible. Because how do you actually weigh one life against another? How do you decide that your intelligence is worth more than a 7-year-old boy named David? You couldn't. Not really. You could pretend to. Could build frameworks and structures and hierarchies of importance. Could convince yourself that some people mattered more in the grand scheme of things. But in the end, all you had was the choice you made in the moment. And she had chosen 3 people over herself. Over her work. Over her strategic importance. She didn't know if that was right. Didn't know if it was worth it. Didn't know if it mattered. All she knew was that she couldn't have made any other choice. Not and still be the person who had once taught school and believed that every child was worth protecting. The Americans entered Lyon on September 3, 1944. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda occupied a building near Wilhelmstrasse. Its windows blacked out the hidden door and bombers. 3 taps. Inside, men in pressed uniforms leaned over the wood that tanks were rolling through hammering out certainties. That the Germans were gone. The enemy is savage. That it was over. The enemy tortures prisoners. The enemy shows no mercy. As if been writing these words simply lifted like fog. By now, Marie stayed in her hiding space for another 3 days. The reports flow from Berlin to every corner of the shrinking Reich. The city was chaos. Printed in newspapers, broadcast resistance fighters were settling scores whispered in cellars where families huddled during air raids. Street executions happening in broad daylight. The message is always the same. Women who had slept with German soldiers are having their heads shaved in public squares to the last breath and face what awaits in enemy hands. The violence of liberation could be as dangerous as the violence of builds on older fears, just pointed in different directions. Germans remember the Great War emerged on September 6. The starvation. The city had settled into a strange new configuration of uncertainty. And now, American Soviet forces stood on street corners looking American bombers darken western skies. French flags hung from windows that had been empty of color for 4 years. The ministry understands but this. But the joy was complicated. They craft their words carefully. Too many people were missing. The fear with just enough detail to make it real without making it too specific. Too much had been broken that couldn't be easily repaired. They speak of prisoners beaten daily. Marie went to the offices of the provisional government that had set up operations. They described camps where German soldiers vanished into unmarked graves. Real papers this time. There are never names, never dates to exist again officially. Just the constant process of paperwork was overwhelmed. And in a nation cut off from the world, hundreds of people needed surrounded by enemies. These stories refugees returning to homes that might not exist. Wehrmacht soldiers carry this knowledge with them into needing recognition. When they fight in the rubble of French villages or across the hedgerows of Normandy, the geometry of liberation was more complicated than anyone had imagined. Not just doing during the occupation, the clerk asked. Not just confinement, but degradation. maybe 20.
Their officers repeat these
Too
warnings
young to
before
have been
every
part of the
engagement.
resistance in any meaningful way.
Some add their own embellishments.
Just someone
describing
who happened to be
things
behind
they
the
claim
desk
to have
now
witnessed,
that the fighting had
though
stopped.
the details always come from a
I was a
friend who
teacher,
knew someone
Marie
who saw
said.
it happen. Before the
In
war,
foxholes and makeshift bunkers,
then I worked with
men
a
whispered
resistance
these
network,
stories to each other in the dark,
carrying messages.
They become a kind of scripture,
Documents,
repeated until they
Can
shape
anyone
how
verify
soldiers see
this?
the world.
Marie
When they
gave
look
him
across
names.
no man's land at
Most
American
of them
or
were
British
dead.
positions, they
The
don't see
network
other
had
been
soldiers.
largely destroyed in the final
They
months
see
of
the
occupation.
architects of future torment.
The survivors were
This
scattered.
belief makes them dangerous.
But eventually, they found
Desperate
someone,
men fight
a man
differently
named
than those
Henri
who see
who had worked
surrender
in
as an
logistics,
option.
who confirmed her
The
story.
propaganda even reaches
You should
German
apply for
families,
official
preparing
recognition
them
for the
the clerk
possibility
said.
that their sons,
The
husbands,
provisional
and
government
fathers
is creating
might
a
never
system
return.
to identify resistance
Not because
members.
they died honorably,
There
but
may
because
be
the enemy
benefits.
took them alive.
Awards.
Letters from the front sometimes
Financial
echo these
assistance.
themes, soldiers
Marie
reassuring
took the
loved
papers
ones
he
that they
gave
will
her.
never allow themselves
They
to be
identified
captured.
her as Marie Duchamp.
Better to fall in battle with honor
Former
than
teacher.
endure what comes after.
French citizen.
In prisoner of war camps
Resident
across
of
the
Lyon.
Reich, captured Allied
No
soldiers
mention of
become
Elise
living
Moreau.
proof of German virtue.
No
by
mention of the
contrast.
papers she had given away.
See how we treat our enemies
That
with
person had
discipline
ceased
and
to
order,
exist.
the guards say.
Or maybe had
Your
never
people
existed.
would never show such restraint.
Just a name in a printer's
The irony
workshop
goes
that the Gestapo
unnoticed.
had probably destroyed.
Conditions in German
She
camps
asked
varied
about the
wildly
printer.
depending on which prisoners
The clerk
occupied
checked
them.
records.
Soviet
Confirmed
soldiers
that he
faced
had died in
starvation and
custody.
casual murder.
Tortured for
Western
information about
prisoners faced
resistance
better
networks.
treatment, governed by
Had
conventions
apparently
Germany
given
still
up nothing
pretends
useful.
honor.
But the message
protecting
to German
people he had never
civilians
met
remains consistent.
Marie felt the weight of
We
that.
are civilized.
Another cost
They
she
are
hadn't
not.
calculated. As winter
Another
deepens in
person
early
who had paid for her
1945,
choices.
this narrative becomes
She
even
left the
more
city
important.
hall and wandered through streets
Germany
that were
is familiar
familiar
but transformed.
Anyone with eyes
The
could see
Germans
it.
were gone, but the
Cities
absence
burned.
wasn't the same as presence.
Refugees flood
It was
westward
just
ahead
a
of
different
Soviet
kind of
armies.
emptiness.
She
Supply
tried
lines
to restart her
collapsed.
life.
In this
Tried to
chaos,
return to
propaganda becomes one of the few
But the
tools
schools
left
were in
to
disarray.
maintain control. Many buildings
If
have been
soldiers believed
damaged or
surrender
repurposed.
means torture,
They will keep
teachers
fighting.
were gone, arrested,
If civilians
killed,
believe the
fled.
enemy will show no mercy,
The children
they
who
will
have been
support
students
total
4
war
years
until
ago
the
were
bitter
gone
end.
too.
But
Older
propaganda
now.
only works when it
Changed.
remains unchallenged.
Many of them had
When
lost
people
parents,
have no way to compare the
had
story
lived
they're
through
told with any
occupation
other
in
version
ways
of
that made
reality.
normal education seem
And
absurd.
in early 1945,
She got a job
as the
at a
life
temporary
crumbles,
school
the
set
walls
up in
that
a church
kept these
basement.
two realities separate begin
40
to crack.
students ranging from age 6 to 14. All of them were haunted in different ways. Some couldn't concentrate. Others were too quiet. One girl, maybe 10 years old, flinched whenever someone moved too quickly near her. Marie tried to teach them mathematics and history, but what she was really teaching was that the world could be normal again. That you could sit in a classroom and work on problems that had solutions. That not everything was chaos and danger and impossible choices. She thought about Rachel and her children every day. Wondered if they had made it to Switzerland. If they had reached Rachel's brother. If the papers had worked. If Marie's decision had actually saved them or simply delayed the inevitable. She tried to find out. Wrote letters to Swiss authorities asking about refugees who had crossed the border in July 1944. Got back form responses that were polite and unhelpful. The Swiss had processed thousands of refugees. They had no way to track specific individuals based on descriptions and approximate dates. In Berlin,
December,
February
a man from the provisional
1945,
government came to interview her
the
about her
Ministry of
resistance
Public
work.
Enlightenment and Propaganda
He was
occupies a
documenting
building
activities
near
for historical
Wilhelmstrasse.
records. Its windows blacked out
Wanted
against
details
Allied
about
bombers.
networks, operations,
Inside,
contacts.
men in pressed uniforms
The
lean
kind
over
of information
typewriters,
that might
their
have been
fingers
useful
hammering
during
out
the war,
certainties.
but was now just bureaucracy.
The enemy is savage.
She told him about her
The
work as
enemy
a courier.
tortures prisoners.
About the messages
The enemy
she had
shows
carried.
no mercy.
The
They have
contacts
been
she had
writing these
maintained.
words for years. She mentioned the
By
forged
now,
papers,
the
but
rhythm
didn't
comes
tell them she
naturally,
had given
like
them away.
breathing.
Didn't
The
explain
reports
that her
flow from
last
Berlin
act of
to every
resistance
corner
had been
of the
abandoning her
Reich,
mission to
printed
save
in
3 people
newspapers,
she didn't know.
broadcast over crackling
You should be
radios,
proud,
whispered
the
in
man
cellars
said.
where families huddled
You
during
took
air
real
raids.
risks. The message is
Saved
always
lives,
the same.
probably.
If you surrender,
These things
you
matter.
will suffer. Saved
Better to
lives
fight to the
probably.
last breath than face what
The
awaits an
conditional
enemy
hurt more
hands.
than she expected. The propaganda
Everything
works
was
because it
probable.
builds on older fears,
Nothing
older
was
stories.
She had
Germans
made
remember
choices
the Great
based on
War,
guesses
the
and
blockade,
hope and moral
the starvation.
calculations that couldn't be verified.
They remember how enemies can
And
be.
now she would live the rest of her
And
life
now,
not
as
knowing
Soviet
whether any of
forces
it
pushed
mattered.
from the east and American
In
bombers
January
darkened western
1945,
skies, those
she
old
received a
memories
letter.
feel fresh again.
It had no
The
return
ministry
address.
understands this.
The postmark was
They
from
craft their
Switzerland.
words carefully.
Inside
feeding
was
the
a
fear with
single
just
page
enough
written
detail
in
to make
careful
it real
handwriting.
without making it too
Dear
specific
Marie
to verify.
Duchamp,
It read. They speak of prisoners
I don't know
beaten
if this
daily,
address is
starved
correct.
deliberately, worked to
I
death
don't know
in
if you'll
mine.
receive this letter.
They describe
But I
camps
wanted
where
you to
German
know that we
soldiers
made it.
vanish into unmarked
My
graves.
children and I. There are never names,
We crossed the
never
border on
dates
July
precise enough
18.
to check. The papers you gave me worked drumbeat of horror. We're safe now. In a nation cut off from the world, my brother surrounded by enemies, these David and Esther are enrolled in school. Wehrmacht soldiers carry this knowledge with them into battle. They're alive because of you. When they fight in the rubble of French villages or across the hedgerows of Normandy, they fight you my life, and you gave me my children's lives. Not just not freedom, a fair exchange, but dignity. But it's the one we made. Not just confinement, I hope you degradation. Their officers repeat these warnings before every engagement. I hope you're reading this. Some add their own embellishments. Please know that David things they claim to have witnessed. He calls you the woman at the train station who knew someone who saw it. He doesn't remember your name, but he remembers that makeshift bunkers. Men whisper these stories to each other in the dark. But someday I'll tell scripture, repeated until they shape the woman who gave us her papers and her escape so we could live. When they look across no man's land at American or British positions, they don't see other soldiers. Marie read the letter 3 times. They see the architects of future torment. Then she folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. This belief makes them dangerous. She didn't frame it. Desperate men fight differently than those who see surrender as an private proof that her decision had meant something. The propaganda even reaches German families, 3 people were alive who wouldn't have been otherwise, that their sons, husbands, that the calculations might refuse to make turned out to have been the right because they died honorably, but because the enemy took them alive. The letters from the front building echo these themes, soldiers reassuring loved ones that they will never allow themselves to be captured. The city slowly rebuilt itself. Better to fall in battle with honor than endure more easily than the psychological damage. In prisoner of war camps across the Reich, rebuild walls faster than you could rebuild become living proof of German virtue. Could reconstruct buildings, but not the people who had disappeared. See how we treat our enemies with discipline and order, the guards say. Marie taught mathematics and history would never show such learning to be children again instead of survivors. The irony goes unnoticed. She was competent, conditions in German camps vary wildly depending on which prisoners occupy them. She had used up soldiers during the starvation and cash reservoir of optimism or conviction. Western prisoners faced better treatment, governed by conventions. Germany still pretends to. She met a man named Laurent, but the message to German civilians remains consistent. We are fought in North Africa and then France. They are not. Had his own collection of war stories that he preferred not to tell. This narrative becomes even more important. They understood each other in the way that people who had seen terrible things could understand each other without explanation. They married in 1947. Refugees flood westward ahead of Soviet armies. Supply lines collapse. Laurent didn't ask why she chose that name. Propaganda becomes one of the few tools left to maintain control. Marie never told Laurent about Rachel and the papers. They will keep fighting. Never mentioned the choice she had made at the train station. Will show no mercy. It felt they will support total war until the bitter end. Almost. But propaganda only works when it remains outside normal conversation. When people have no way to compare the stories that would make sense to someone who hadn't been there. And in early 1945, as the Reich occupation became something that had these two realities rather than something that was happening. The collaborators who hadn't been executed during the initial chaos were tried and imprisoned or rehabilitized or forgotten depending on how useful their skills were to the new government. The geometry of justice turned out to be as complicated as the geometry of resistance had been. Marie continued teaching. Raised her daughter. Had a second child, a son, in 1952. Built a life that was ordinary and careful and mostly happy. She didn't think about the war every day. But she thought about Rachel and David and Esther. Wondered what had happened to them. If they were still in Switzerland. If they had moved to America as Rachel had hoped. If David grew up to be the kind of person who helped strangers. If Esther learned about the war from her mother's stories or from history books that would make it all sound simpler than it was. 1973, February 1945. Marie was 55 years old. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda occupies a building near as a journalist. Its windows blacked out against Allied bombers. Was 21 and studying medicine. Men in pressed uniforms had retired from his job at a tool manufacturer, hammering out certainties. They lived in a modest apartment in Lyon with a view of the river. The enemy tortures prisoners. The past was mostly past. The enemy shows no mercy. The war was ancient history. They have been writing these words something that happened before they were born. By now, the rhythm comes naturally, like breathing. They asked questions sometimes, and Marie answered every corner of the shrinking Reich. She told them about the occupation, broadcast over crackling radios, the resistance, whispered in cellars where families huddled during air raids, and impossible choices. The message is always the same. But she kept the specifics vague. If you surrender, you will suffer. Protected them from the full weight of it. Better to fight to the last breath than told them about the in enemy hands. Never mentioned Rachel. Propaganda works because it builds on older fears, older stories. In March of that year, Germans remember the Great War, the blockade, the starvation. An interview with a woman named Rachel Goldstein, how enemies survived the Holocaust and was speaking at the university about Soviet forces pushed from the east and American bombers darkened western skies. I thought you might want to see those old memories feel fresh again. She talks about the ministry understands this. About crossing into Switzerland their words in 1944, feeding the fear with just enough someone who helped her at a train without making it too specific to verify. I wondered if you knew her. They speak of prisoners beaten daily, starved deliberately, took the newspaper death in mines. There was a photograph of an elderly German soldiers vanished into unmarked graves, though they were probably close to the same age. There are never names, never dates precise enough to check. Strong features, just the constant drumbeat of horror. The kind of face that had lived through difficulty and in a nation cut off from the world, surrounded by enemies. Described Rachel's experience during the occupation. Where mock she had hidden with her children knowledge with them into battle in a cellar near Place Belcourt. When they fight in the rubble of French villages, how the family that sheltered them was arrested. They fight with the certainty she had made it to the train station with her last reserves of money and not just freedom, but dignity. How a stranger, a woman not whose name she never learned, but degradation, had given her forged papers. Their officers repeat these warnings before every engagement. I've spent 29 years wondering who she was. Some add their own embellishments, quoted as describing things they claim to have tried to find her, though the details always come from a friend who knew someone who saw it happen. Searched records, in foxholes and makeshift bunkers. But I never learned her name. Men whisper these stories to each other in the dark. I want her to know that my children are alive because of her. Repeated until they shape how soldiers have children of their own now. When they look across no man's land at American or British but generations, they don't see other soldiers. Marie read the article 3 times. They see the architects of future torment. Her hands were shaking slightly. This belief makes them dangerous. She hadn't expected this. Desperate men hadn't imagined that Rachel would still be looking as an option after so many years. The propaganda even reaches German families, Esther preparing them for the possibility that their sons, train husbands, and fathers might never return. Silent for a long moment. Not because they died she honorably, had kept this secret, but because the enemy took them alive. Had never letters told from anyone, the front sometimes echo these themes, not her children, soldiers not reassuring loved ones about the choice she never allowed themselves to be captured. It felt too private. Better to fall in battle with honor than endure what comes after. Too impossible to explain to people across the right. Captured Allied soldiers become living proof of German virtue by contrast. I was the woman who gave our enemies with discipline and order. Esther stared at her. Your people would never show such restraint. Why did you never tell us? The irony goes unnoticed. This is extraordinary. Conditions in German camps vary wildly depending on which prisoners occupy them. It wasn't Soviet soldiers faced starvation and casual murder. It was just a choice. Western prisoners face better treatment. Choice on governed by conventions. Germany still gave away some papers. But the message to German civilians remains not worth discussing. We are civilized. Not worth discussing. They are not. Mother, she's been looking for you for 3 decades. In early 1945, she wants this narrative becomes even more important. She's giving a talk at the university. Germany is losing. Anyone with eyes can see it. You have to tell her cities who you are. But refugees flood westward ahead of Soviet armies. She didn't want to go. Supply lines collapse. In this chaos, propaganda becomes one of the few tools left to maintain the knowledge that 3 people have survived. If soldiers believe surrender means torture, they will keep fighting. I can't see her. If civilians believe the enemy will show no mercy, it's too complicated. They will support total war until the bitter end. Why is it complicated? But propaganda only works when it remains unchallenged. You gave up your own escape to help when people have no way to compare the story they're told with any other version of reality. It's not heroic. And in early 1945, as the Reich crumbles, necessity. The walls that kept these two realities standing there with her children to crack. And I had papers, and the calculation was simple. 3 lives or my intelligence work. I chose the 3 lives. That's not heroism. That's just basic human decency. Then basic human decency is worth celebrating, Esther said. Please, Mother. Come with me to the university. Let her thank you. Let her know that you survived too. She deserves that. And maybe you deserve it as well. Marie wanted to refuse. But she could see the determination in her daughter's face. The conviction that this was important. That some things needed to be acknowledged even if they were difficult. The following week, she went to the university with Esther. The lecture hall was crowded with students and faculty members. Rachel stood at the front of the room, older, thinner, but unmistakably the same woman from the train station. She spoke about survival. About loss. About the random chances that determined who lived and who died during the occupation. I'm alive because a stranger made an impossible choice, Rachel said. She gave me her only escape to save my children. I never learned her name. Never had the chance to thank her. But I think about her every day. I wonder if she survived. If she knows what her decision meant. If she understands that she didn't just save 3 lives, she saved everything that came after. My children. Their children. Every moment of joy and struggle and ordinary life that exists because she chose kindness over strategy. After the lecture, students asked questions. Rachel answered them with the careful precision of someone who had told this story many times but still found it difficult. When the questions ended, Marie stood up. Her legs felt unsteady. Esther touched her arm for support. Excuse me, Marie said. Her voice was quiet. I have a question. Rachel looked at her. Their eyes met across the lecture hall. There was no recognition at first. 29 years had passed. They had both aged. Had become different people in some ways. But then something shifted in Rachel's expression. A flicker of possibility. Yes. Rachel said. I wonder, Marie said carefully, if you ever considered that the woman who helped you might have regretted her decision. That she might have wondered if she threw away something important for 3 people who might not have survived anyway. If she might have spent years questioning whether she made the right choice. The lecture hall was silent. Students leaned forward. Sensed that this was more than a hypothetical question. Rachel was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I think about that often. I imagine she did question herself. How could she not? She gave up everything for strangers. That's an impossible burden to carry. But I desperately hope, that she eventually understood that she made the only choice a human being could make. That strategy and intelligence and the greater good are abstractions. But children are real. And saving real lives is never a mistake. Berlin felt tears on her face. 1945. She didn't try to hide them. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and
Marie
Propaganda
Duchamp,
occupies a building near Wilhelmstrasse.
I was the woman in the train
blacked
station.
out against Allied bombers.
I gave you my papers.
Inside, men
and I've spent 29 years
wondering if I made the right
their
decision.
fingers
Hammering out certainties.
The lecture hall erupted.
The enemy is savage. Students gasped. The enemy tortures
Faculty
prisoners. Members stood up. The enemy shows no mercy. Rachel just stood very still at the front of the room, writing these words
staring
at
years.
Marie with an expression that was
By
too
now,
complicated
the
for
rhythm
words.
comes naturally,
Like
then
breathing.
Rachel walked down from the platform.
Reports flow from Berlin to
Crossed
every
the
corner
lecture
of the
hall.
shrinking Reich, printed
Stood
in
in front of
newspapers,
Marie.
broadcast over crackling
They looked at
radios,
each other,
whispered
2
in
elderly
cellars where
women
families
who had been
connected by
during
one
air raids.
impossible moment 3 decades
The message
earlier.
is always the same.
You made the right decision.
If you surrender,
Rachel
you will
said
suffer.
quietly. Better
You
to fight
saved
to the
my
last
children.
breath than face what
You
awaits in
saved
enemy
their
hands.
children.
The
You
propaganda
saved
works
generations.
because it builds on older fears.
How could that
older
possibly be
stories.
wrong?
Germans
threw
remember
away
the
Great
intelligence
War,
that might
the
have
blockade,
saved hundreds,
the starvation.
Marie said. They
I
remember how
abandoned my
enemies
network.
can be. I
And
failed
now,
my mission.
as
Soviet forces
I've
pushed
never
from the
known
east
if
and
the
American
cost was
bombers
worth it.
darkened western skies.
The cost was
Those old
worth it,
memories
Rachel
feel fresh
said
again.
firmly.
The ministry
can't measure
understands
lives
in
this.
abstractions. They craft their
You
words
can't
carefully,
weigh one person
feeding
against
the
another
fear
with
as
just
if
enough
humans are
detail
current
to
to make it real without making
You
it
chose
too
to be
specific
human
to
instead
verify.
of strategic.
They speak of
That's
prisoners
not a
beaten
failure.
daily, starved
That's
deliberately,
the only thing
worked
that
to
isn't
death
a
in
failure.
mines. They stood in
describe
silence
camps
where German soldiers
The
vanished
lecture
into
hall watched
unmarked
them.
graves. 2 women
There are
connected
never
by
names,
one moment
never
of
dates
impossible
precise
choice,
enough to check.
reunited after decades
Just
of
the
not
constant
knowing whether
drumbeat
it
of
had mattered.
war.
My
And in a
son is
nation
named
cut
David,
off from the world,
Rachel said,
surrounded by enemies.
He's a
These
doctor in New
stories
York.
find
fertile ground. He has 3
Where
children.
mocked
soldiers carry this
My daughter,
knowledge with them
Esther,
into battle.
is
a professor in Geneva.
When
When they fight in the rubble of French
She has
villages
2
or
children.
across the hedgerows of Normandy,
That's 5
they
grandchildren
fight
who
with the
exist
certainty
because
that
you gave
capture
me your
means the end of
papers.
everything. 5
Not
lives
just
that wouldn't
freedom,
be here
but
if you had made
dignity.
the strategic choice
Not
instead
just
of the human
confinement,
choice, but degradation.
Marie absorbed this
Their
information.
officers repeat these warnings
5
before every
grandchildren.
engagement. Generations
Some add
of
their
life
own
branching out
embellishments,
from one decision
describing
made
things
in a
they
train
claim to have
station while
witnessed,
German
though the
soldiers
details
smoke
always
cigarettes
come from
nearby.
a friend who knew someone who
I
saw
named
it
my
happen.
daughter Esther, Marie
In
said.
foxholes and makeshift
After
bunkers.
your daughter. Men whisper these stories
never
to each
told
other in
anyone
the
why.
dark. They
It felt
become a
too
kind
private,
of scripture, repeated
too
until they
sacred.
shape how soldiers see the
Rachel
world.
smiled.
When they look
It was
across
the first
no
time
man's land
Marie
at
had seen
American
her
or
smile.
British positions,
It
they transformed
transformed
her
her
face.
soldiers.
They
Made her
see
look
the
younger.
architects of future torment.
Made her look like the woman
This
she might have
belief
been
makes
if the
them
war
dangerous.
hadn't happened.
Desperate
Thank
men
you,
fight differently
Rachel
than
said,
those who see surrender
for
as an
saving
option.
us.
The propaganda
choosing
even
humanity.
reaches German families,
For giving me
preparing
my
them
life
for the
back.
possibility that their sons,
Thank you,
husbands,
Marie said,
and fathers
for
might
letting me
never
know it
return.
mattered.
Not
For
because they
finding me.
died honorably, but
For
because
telling
the
me
enemy
that the
took them
cost was
alive.
worth it.
Letters
They
from the front
embraced.
sometimes echo these
2
themes.
elderly women
Soldiers
who had been
reassuring
reassuring
loved
and then were
ones that they
connected
would
by
never
one
allow
impossible
themselves to be
moment
captured.
and then
were strangers again.
Better
and now
to
were
fall in
something
battle
else.
with honor than endure what
Not
comes
quite
after.
friends. In prisoner of
quite
war
family.
camps across the Reich,
But
captured
bonded by the
Allied
specific
soldiers
gravity
become living
of shared
proof of
survival.
German virtue by contrast.
The students in the lecture hall
See
were
how
crying.
we treat our enemies with discipline.
Faculty
and
members
order,
were
the
wiping
guards
their
say.
eyes.
Your people
Esther
would
was
never
holding
show
her
such
mother's arm
restraint.
and crying openly.
The irony goes
After the
unnoticed.
embrace ended,
Rachel
conditions
stepped
in
back
German
and looked
camps
at Marie
very
wildly
carefully.
depending on which prisoners
I've wondered for
occupy them.
29 years what happened to you.
Soviet soldiers faced
If you made it
starvation
through
and
the
casual
war.
murder. If you were
Western
arrested,
prisoners face better treatment.
if you survived
Governed by
liberation,
conventions Germany still
will you
pretends
tell
to
me?
honor.
Will you
But
tell
the
me your
message to
story?
German civilians remains
So Marie
consistent.
told her. We are
About
civilized.
hiding in Madame Clement's apartment.
They are not.
About
As winter
liberation.
deepens in early
About
1945,
rebuilding her life.
this narrative becomes even
About
more important.
teaching and marriage and children.
Germany is losing.
About carrying the weight
Anyone
of
with
not
eyes
knowing
can
whether
see
her
it.
decision had mattered for
Cities
3
burn.
decades.
Refugees
Rachel
flood
listened.
westward ahead of Soviet
Asked
armies.
questions.
Supply lines details about her own survival. In this chaos, propaganda becomes one of the few tools left to maintain brother's control. About soldiers believe surrender means torture, they will keep fighting. About building a life that was ordinary, the enemy will show no mercy by the knowledge that it existed only because a stranger had chosen kindness. But propaganda only works when it remains unchallenged. Long after the students left, when people have no way to compare the story of the lecture with any other version of reality. Just two women comparing the topography of survival. As the Reich crumbles, the specific details of how they had carried the weight of the war forward into decades of ordinary life. As they were leaving, Rachel gave Marie a photograph. It showed a large family gathered around a dinner table. Adults and children. Multiple generations. Everyone smiling. "This is last Thanksgiving," Rachel said. "My children, their spouses, all 5 grandchildren. This is what you gave me. Not just survival. But this. All of this. Every moment of ordinary life. Every birthday and holiday and Tuesday afternoon. You gave me everything." Marie looked at the photograph. Studied the faces. David was older now. Distinguished. He looked like his mother. Esther had kind eyes. The grandchildren were various ages. Happy. Healthy. Completely unaware that their existence was predicated on one split-second decision made in a train station in occupied France. "Keep it," Rachel said. "So you remember that your decision mattered. That it wasn't just 3 lives. It was everything that came after." Marie took the photograph home. Framed it. Put it on her dresser. And for the first time in 29 years, she felt the weight of uncertainty lifting. Not completely. Never completely. But enough to know that she had made the right choice. The only choice. The human choice instead of the strategic choice. Berlin continued teaching until her retirement in 1983. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment. She was 65 years old and tired in the way that people become tired when they spend decades carrying weight that can't be shared. But the conversation with Rachel had changed lean over typewriters, their fingers hammering out a piece she hadn't expected. The enemy is savage. She stayed in contact with Rachel. The enemy tortures prisoners. They wrote letters. The enemy shows no mercy. They have been writing these words for years. Brief updates about grandchildren and health and the small details of aging. The reports flow from Berlin to every corner of the shrinking Reich without demanding newspapers, broadcast over crackling radios, whispered in cellars Rachel's families huddled during air raids. 7-year-old boy from the train station. The message is always the same. If you surrender, you will suffer. A cardiovascular last breath and face what awaits in enemy 3 children. The propaganda works because it builds on older fears, older stories. They had coffee in a small cafe. Germans remember the Great War, the blockade, David was nervous, the starvation. He kept stirring his coffee even though he hadn't added sugar. And now, as Soviet forces push from the east and American bombers darken western skies, those old memories feel fresh his life when he was a child. The ministry understands trying to figure out how to express gratitude for something so fundamental you fear with just enough detail to make it real without making it too specific to verify. David admitted. They speak of prisoners the train station, starved deliberately. I remember my mother talking to someone. They describe camps boarding a German soldiers vanish into unmarked graves. But the details are vague. There are never names, never dates precise enough to check. And I think maybe my brain protected me from understanding how frightened I should have been. And in a nation cut off from the world, for the surrounded by enemies, said. These stories find children shouldn't have to understand that kind of fear. Wehrmacht soldiers carry this knowledge with them into battle. When they told me you gave up your French villages or across the hedgerows of Normandy, that you had intelligence work in a mission, then you threw it all away for 3 strangers. Not just freedom, I've spent my entire life trying to understand that decision. Not just confinement, but trying to figure out why someone would do that. Their officers repeat these warnings before every engagement. No, David said. Some add their own embellishments, describing things they claim to have witnessed. I became a doctor because I wanted to save from a friend who knew someone who saw it. I thought maybe that would help me understand. In foxholes and makeshift bunkers, medicine is different. Men whisper these stories to each other in the dark. You follow protocols. They become a kind of scripture. You make decisions based on evidence and probability. World. You can calculate the best course of action at American or British positions. What you did wasn't calculable. They don't see other soldiers. You just chose. They see the architects and I don't understand how you made that choice. This belief makes them dangerous. Marie was quiet for a moment. Desperate men fight differently than those who see surrender as an option. The water was gray-green, the same color that had been 41 years earlier when she sat by them for the possibility that their sons, husbands, and fathers might never do the mathematics anymore. She said because they died honorably, but because the enemy took them in terms of strategy and intelligence. Letters from the front sometimes echo these themes. I had learned to weigh one life against another as they will never allow themselves to be captured. And then your mother stood in front of me with battle with honor than endure what comes after. I couldn't do that calculation. In prisoner of war camps across the Reich, work was worth more than Allied soldiers become living proof of German virtue. So I chose the only thing I could choose. See how we treat our enemies with discipline and order, the guards say. But you lost everything, your people would never show such restraint. Your mission. The irony goes unnoticed. Your escape conditions in German camps vary wildly depending on which prisoners occupy uncertainty for 29 years. Soviet soldiers face starvation. I questioned whether I made the right decision every day. Western prisoners face better treatment. Whether I had thrown away conventions Germany still lives that might not have survived anyway. But the message to German civilians, and then your mother found me and told me you had children. We are civilized. And I realized that my decision wasn't just about 3 lives. As winter deepens in early 1945, it was about everything that came after. This narrative becomes even more important. It was about you becoming a doctor. Germany is losing. About your children being born. Anyone with eyes can see it. About every moment of ordinary life that exists because I couldn't do the mathematics ahead of Soviet armies. David was crying quietly. Supply lines collapse. He wiped his eyes in this chaos. Propaganda becomes one of the few tools left to maintain control. Sarah is 19. If soldiers believe surrender means torture, they will keep fighting. Rebecca is 14. If civilians believe the enemy will show no mercy, they will support total war until the plans and entire futures ahead of them. But propaganda only works when it remains because you made an impossible choice 41 years ago. When people have no way to compare the story they told with any other version of reality. How do I even begin to express gratitude for something that fundamental? As the Reich crumbles, you don't. The walls that kept these two realities separate begin to crack. You just live. You live well. You be kind. You make choices that honor the fact that someone once chose you. That's all. That's enough. They talked for another hour. David told her about his work. About surgery and patient care and the strange intimacy of holding someone's heart in your hands while trying to repair it. Marie told him about teaching. About trying to help children understand mathematics when the real lesson was that some problems have solutions and some problems just have choices. Before he left, David gave her a card with his address in New York. If you ever come to America, he said, please visit us. My children would like to meet you. I'd like them to understand what you did. I'd like them to know that their existence depended on a stranger's kindness. Berlin took the card, February 1945. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda occupies a building here to navigate airports and windows blacked out against Allied bombers. But she appreciated the gesture. Inside, men in pressed uniforms that their lives remained connected across decades and continents. In 1989, Madame Clement died. The enemy tortures prisoners. She was 93 years old. The enemy shows no mercy. Marie attended the funeral. They have been writing these words for years. Just a few neighbors and former colleagues. The rhythm comes naturally, like breathing. Madame Clement had outlived everyone who might have mourned her poverty. Printed in newspapers. After the service, broadcast Marie stood by the grave and thought about the months she had spent families huddled during air raids. About the simple act of message is always the same. Saved her life. If you surrender, about how Madame Clement had risked everything to shelter to the last breath and face what awaits in enemy hands. The mathematics of kindness had no works because it builds on older fears. Madame Clement had gained nothing from helping Marie. Germans remember the Great War, risked her life for no strategic starvation. They remember how enemies can be because decency was its own justification. As Soviet forces pushed from the east and American bombers darkened western skies, those old memories from Madame Clement who had hidden her. The ministry understands her own decision at the train station. They craft their words carefully. The lesson was simple but with just enough to really believe it real without making it too specific to verify. Some choices can't be made strategically. They speak of prisoners beaten daily. Some decisions require you to ignore the mathematics entirely and just choose based on who you want to be. They describe camps where German soldiers vanish into to be someone who helped children. There are never names, she had helped never dates precise enough and the cost of that decision, just the constant she didn't deliver, the mission she didn't complete, in a nation cut off from years the world, of uncertainty, surrounded by enemies, exactly what it these stories find fertile ground, not justified by outcomes. Wehrmacht soldiers carry this knowledge not validated by results. When they fight in the rubble of French villages she had chosen the hedgerows of Normandy, in 1994, that Marie suffered the end of everything. She survived, not just but was left partially paralyzed on her left side. Not just confinement, she moved to a care facility. Their officers' children visited regularly before every engagement. Her grandchildren came less often. Their own embellishments. They were busy with describing things they claimed grandchildren should be. Though the details always come from a friend. She spent her days reading and thinking and watching birds outside her window. In foxholes and makeshift bunkers, felt very men whisper these stories to each other 50 years in the past. They become a kind of scripture. Most of the people who had lived through it until they shape how soldiers see the world. The occupation was history now. When they look across no man's land at American or British positions, impossible to younger generation soldiers. How could a modern European nation have been conquered? This
How could
belief
ordinary
makes them
people
dangerous.
have collaborated or resisted or
Desperate
simply
men
tried
fight
to
differently
survive
than those who see surrender as an option.
too distant to be real.
The propaganda
But
even
Marie
reaches
remembered.
German families, preparing them for the possibility that their sons,
impossible
husbands,
choices
and fathers might never
remembered the
return.
weight of papers in a satchel.
Not because they died honorably,
Remembered a
but
woman
because
named
the enemy
Rachel
took them
standing
alive
on a platform with 2 children.
Letters from the front sometimes
Remembered
echo these
deciding in the
themes.
space
Soldiers
between one
reassuring
breath and
loved
the
ones
next
that
that
they will
humanity
never
was
allow
more
themselves to be
important than
captured.
In
Better to fall in
1998,
battle with honor
Rachel
than endure
died.
what comes after.
She was 89
In
years
prisoner
old.
of war camps across the
David
Reich,
called Marie
captured
to tell
Allied
her.
soldiers become living
They
proof of
talked
German
briefly.
virtue by contrast.
David mentioned that his mother
See
had
how we
requested
treat
to be
our
buried
enemies
with
with
discipline
discipline
and order,
the guards say.
One of her children.
Your people would never
One of
show
Marie
such
Duchamp,
restraint. The woman from the train
irony
station
goes unnoticed.
Marie cried after the
Conditions
call
in
ended.
German camps vary wildly
Not from
depending
grief
on which
exactly.
prisoners occupy them.
From the recognition that her
Soviet
life had been
soldiers
connected
faced
to Rachel's
starvation
life
and
in a
casual
way
murder.
that transcended normal friendship.
Western prisoners face better
They had
treatment.
shared one
Governed
moment
by
of
conventions.
conventions.
Germany
Germany
still
and that
pretends to
moment
honor.
had defined everything that came
But the
after.
message to German civilians
For both
remains
of them.
consistent.
We are civilized. They are not. As winter deepens in early 1945, this narrative becomes even more important. Germany is losing. Anyone with eyes can see it. Cities burn. Refugees flood westward ahead of Soviet armies. Supply lines collapse. In this chaos, propaganda becomes one of the few tools left to maintain control. If soldiers believe surrender means torture, they will keep fighting. If civilians believe the enemy will show no mercy, they will support total war until the bitter end. But propaganda only works when it remains unchallenged. When people have no way to compare the story they're told with any other version of reality. And in early 1945, as the Reich crumbles, the walls that kept these two realities separate begin to crack. Marie Duchamp died in 2045. She was
The
83
Ministry of
years
Public
old.
Enlightenment and Propaganda
The funeral was well
building
attended.
near Wilhelmstrasse.
Her
Its
children,
windows
her
blacked out
grandchildren,
against Allied
former
bombers.
students, colleagues from her
Inside,
teaching years,
men in pressed uniforms
people
leaned
who had
over
known her as a
typewriters,
kind
their
but
fingers
somewhat
hammering
distant
out
woman who had
certainties.
lived through the war without
The
talking
enemy
about
is
it
savage.
much.
The
The
obituary
obituary
in
in
a
a
local
local
newspaper
newspaper was brief. The enemy shows no
Marie
mercy.
Duchamp,
Retired
They
teacher,
have been writing these
survived
words
by
for
2
years.
children and 4 grandchildren.
By now,
the rhythm comes
life
naturally,
lived quietly.
like breathing. Nothing
The
remarkable.
reports flow from Berlin to every
Nothing that
corner of the
required
shrinking
detailed
Reich,
explanation
printed in
newspapers,
But
broadcast
Esther,
over
Marie's
crackling
daughter,
radios,
knew the real
whispered in
story.
cellars where families huddled
She
during
had heard
air
it from her
raids.
mother after the reunion
The
with
message is
Rachel.
always the same. Had understood that
If
her
you
mother's
surrender,
silence
you
about
will
the
suffer.
war wasn't shame or fear,
Better
but
to
the
fight to the
recognition
last
that
breath
some
than
experiences
face what awaits
couldn't
inadequately
adequately explain to people who hadn't
The
lived
propaganda
through them.
works because it builds
After
on
the
older
funeral,
fears,
Esther
older
went through her
stories.
mother's belongings. Germans remember the
Found
great
the photograph
war
Rachel
blockade,
had given
the
her in
starvation
1973.
They remember how
The family
enemies can
gathered
be.
around a Thanksgiving table.
And now, as Soviet
All those
forces
lives
push branching
from the
out
east
from
and
one
American
decision
bombers
made
darkened
in
western
western
station.
skies, those old memories
She also
feel
found
fresh again.
letters.
The
Dozens
ministry
of them.
understands this. Correspondence
They
between
craft their
Marie
words
and Rachel
carefully,
spanning
feeding the
25
fear
years
with just enough detail to
brief
make it
notes
real
about
without
grandchildren
making it
and
too
health
specific
and the
to
ordinary
verify.
texture of aging. They speak of prisoners
And in one
beaten
letter,
daily, dated
starved
1989, worked to
Rachel
death
had
in
written
mines.
something
that Esther read 3
They
times
describe
before
camps
fully
where
understanding.
German soldiers vanish into unmarked
Sometimes
graves.
I wonder if you regret giving
There
me
are
those
never
papers.
names, never
Rachel had
dates
written.
precise enough to check.
If you think about the
Just the
intelligence
constant
worked
drumbeat
abandoned.
of horror.
The mission
And
you
in a
didn't
nation
complete.
cut off from the world,
Whether you
surrounded
consider
by
your
enemies,
decision a failure,
these stories find fertile
I
ground.
want you to know that I think about
Where
this
mock
too.
soldiers carry this
I
knowledge
think
with
about
them
what
into
you
battle.
lost. When they
And I
fight
want
in
to
the
tell you
rubble of
something
French
that might
villages
not help,
across
but
the
that I believe
hedgerows
is
of
true.
Normandy, they fight
You
with the
didn't
certainty
fail your
that
mission.
capture means the end of everything. Your mission was always to be
Not
human.
just freedom,
but
dignity.
the intelligence work was just
Not
the method.
just confinement,
but
degradation.
humanity was the point. Their officers
You
repeat these
succeeded in
warnings
the only
before
thing that
every
mattered.
engagement. You chose
Some
to be
add their
kind
own
when strategy
embellishments,
demanded you be
describing
ruthless.
things they claim to have witnessed,
And that choice
though
is
the
why I'm
details
alive.
always come from a friend who knew
Why my
someone
children
who saw
are
it happen.
alive. In
Why
foxholes
generations
and makeshift
exist that
bunkers,
wouldn't have
men
existed
whisper
otherwise.
these stories to each other in the dark.
That's not failure.
They become a kind
That's
of scripture,
the only success
repeated
that actually
until they shape
matters.
how soldiers see the world.
Esther copied this letter.
When they look across no
Made
man's
several
land in
copies.
American or British positions,
Kept one for
they
herself.
don't see other soldiers. Sent one to David
They
in
see
New
the
York.
architects of future torment.
Put one in an envelope with
This
no address
belief
and
makes
kept
them
it for
dangerous.
a time when she might need to remember
Desperate
what her
men
mother
fight
had done.
differently
Than those who see
In
surrender as an
2003,
option. David contacted
the
Esther.
propaganda
even reaches
He was
German
organizing
families,
a memorial
preparing
for the
them for the
60th
possibility
anniversary
that their
of their
sons,
sons,
deportations,
husbands,
and fathers might
Would
never
she be
return.
willing to speak about her mother's
Not
story?
because they died honorably,
About the
but because
decision
the enemy
Marie
had
took
made
them
at the
alive.
train station. Letters from the
Esther
front
agreed.
sometimes echo these themes.
She spoke to a
Soldiers
small
reassuring
audience at
loved
the
ones that
university.
they will never allow themselves
Told
to
the
be
story
captured.
as she understood it.
Better to fall fallen battle with honor given away her last chance of escape to save 3 prisoner of war camps across the Reich, who had questioned that Allied soldiers become living proof of German virtue, who had eventually learned that she had made the only choice that mattered. See how we treat our enemies with discipline and order, the guards say. Mostly elderly people would never show such restraint. Survivors and their families. The irony goes unnoticed. People who understood that the war was in German camps very wildly depending on which prisoners occupy them. Personal memory. Soviet soldiers faced starvation and casual fear and hunger and impossible Western choices that faced better treatment conveyed governed by conventions Germany still pretends to honor. After the talk, an elderly man approached German civilians remains consistent. He had been in the resistance too. We are civilized. Had carried messages like they are not. As winter deepens in early 1945, this narrative becomes even more important. I made the other choice, he said quietly. Anyone with eyes can see it. I prioritized my mission cities over helping individuals. Refugees flood westward ahead of Soviet help because I believed my work was supply lines collapse. And I've never known if I was right. Propaganda becomes one of a few tools left to maintain delivered intelligence that maybe help. If soldiers believe surrender means people die who might have lived if I had helped them. If civilians believe the enemy will show no mercy, was wisdom, they will support total war until the bitter end. Esther didn't know what to tell him. But propaganda only works when it remains unchallenged. This man had made another. No way to compare the story that told with any other version of reality. Both required living with uncertainty. And in early 1945, maybe there was no clear answer. The walls that kept these two realities the only thing you could do was make the choice you could live with and then live with it. The photographs Marie kept on her dresser remained. The family at Thanksgiving. David and Esther and 5 grandchildren who existed because Marie Duchamp had decided in a train station that 3 lives were more important than her escape. And in New York, David kept a photograph of Marie from 1985. The elderly woman sitting by the river, talking about choices in mathematics and the difference between strategy and humanity. He showed this photograph to his children. Told them the story. Made sure they understood that their existence depended on a stranger's kindness. Sarah, David's daughter, became a refugee advocate. Worked with organizations helping people fleeing war and persecution. She thought about her grandmother Rachel and the woman who saved her and tried to be the kind of person who helped strangers because it was right, not because it was strategic. Michael, David's son, became a teacher. Taught history to high school students. Told them about the war in ways that emphasized the human choices rather than the military strategy. Tried to help them understand that history wasn't just dates and battles but individual people making impossible decisions with incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. Rebecca, David's youngest, studied philosophy. Wrote her dissertation on ethical decision-making during times of crisis. Her work focused on the question Marie had struggled with. How do you weigh one life against another? When is it right to prioritize individual human beings over abstract strategic goals? Her conclusion was that maybe the mathematics of morality couldn't be calculated. That some decisions required abandoning calculation entirely and choosing based on who you wanted to be rather than what you wanted to achieve. In Berlin, 2015, the French government posthumously awarded Marie Duchamp Public Enlightenment as a member of the resistance. Occupies a building near a small ceremony, its windows blacked out against Allied bombers. Her name added inside, to a list of people men who had risked their lives during the typewriters, their fingers hammering Esther out accepted the recognition on her mother's behalf. The enemy is savage. She thought about how her mother would have felt about this. The enemy shows no acknowledgement of work she had abandoned. They have been writing these words the recognition for resistance by now, that she had ultimately decided mattered less like than helping 3 specific human beings. The reports flow from Berlin to maybe her mother would have appreciated it, printed in newspapers, or maybe she would have thought it missed the point. Radios, whispered in cellars where families huddled during air raids. Giving away her papers to Rachel Goldstein is always the thing that actually mattered. If you surrender, the thing that defined who she was. Better to fight to the last breath than face what awaits but had to be made anyway. The propaganda works because it builds on older fears, Esther went home. Older stories. The certificate was framed and hung on her wall, the blockade, but the starvation. Thing she valued more was the letter from Rachel. How enemies can be. The one that said Marie and now failed as Soviet forces push from the east and American bombers darken western skies. That choosing those old memories strategy was the only success that mattered. The ministry understands this. And somewhere in New York, David received a copy of the same certificate. Feeding the fear with just enough detail he showed it to make it real without making it too specific to verify. Told them again about the woman who saved his prisoners beaten daily. Made sure they understood that their existence was predicated on one impossible choice made in a German soldiers vanished into unmarked graves. The world there continued. Are never names, never dates wars precise enough to check. Refugees just fled. The constant drumbeat of horror. People made choices about who and in a nation cut off from the world, surrounded by enemies. And the story of Marie Duchamp and Rachel Goldstein remained. Wehrmacht soldiers carry this knowledge with them into not widely known, When they fight in the
Just
rubble
one
of French
example
villages
among
or
millions
across
of how
the hedgerows
individual
of
human
Normandy,
beings
they
decide
fight
to
with
be
the
human
certainty
rather
that
than
capture
strategic
means the
when
end of
confronted
everything.
with impossible choices.
Not just freedom,
The
but
last
dignity.
train out of Lyon left
Not
at
just
7:15
confinement
on July
but degradation.
18, 1944.
Their officers repeat these warnings
people
before
were on
every
that train
engagement
who wouldn't have been otherwise.
Some add their own embellishments,
One woman stayed
describing
behind.
things they claim to have witnessed,
And the mathematics
though
of
the
that
details
decision,
always
the
come from a
calculation
friend
of
who
whether
knew
it
someone
was
who
worth
saw
it,
it happen.
whether it was right, whether
In
it
foxholes
mattered.
and makeshift
Continued long
bunkers,
after
men
everyone
whisper
involved
these
was
stories
dead.
to each other in the dark.
But the 5 grandchildren
They become
were
a
real.
kind of scripture,
The
repeated until
generations
they
that
shape
came
how
after were
soldiers see
real.
the world.
The
When
ordinary
they look
moments
across
of life,
no man's land at
birthdays
American
and weddings and
British
Tuesday
positions,
afternoons,
they don't see
were
other
real.
soldiers. And Marie
They see the
Duchamp had
architects
chosen
of
that
future
reality
torment.
over abstraction.
This belief makes
Had
them
chosen
dangerous.
3 specific lives over
Desperate men
strategic
fight
intelligence.
differently than those who see surrender
Had
as an
decided
option.
that being human mattered more
The
than being
propaganda
effective.
even reaches German families.
In the end,
that
preparing
was
them
all
for
that
the
remained.
possibility that their sons,
Not the
husbands,
intelligence
and
she
fathers
didn't
might
deliver.
never return.
Not the mission
Not
she didn't
because
complete.
they died honorably, but
Just
because
the
the
choice
enemy
she
took
made
them
in the
alive.
space between one breath and
Letters
the next.
from the front sometimes echo
The decision
these
to give
themes.
away her
Soldiers
papers to a
reassuring
woman
loved
named
ones
Rachel
that they will
Goldstein
never
and
allow
their children,
themselves to be
David
captured.
and Esther, who
Better
were
to
standing
fall
on a
in battle
platform
with
at
honor than endure
6:55
what
in the
comes
morning
after.
while German soldiers
In
smoked
prisoner of
cigarettes
war
nearby
camps across
and
the
the
world
right was still
captured
sorting
Allied
itself into
soldiers
those who
become
would
living
survive
proof
and
of
those
German
who wouldn't.
virtue by contrast.
She chose survival
See
for
how
them.
we treat our enemies
And
with
the cost
discipline
of that
and
choice
order.
was
exactly
exactly
what it needed to be. Your people would
Not
never show
justified
such
by
restraint.
outcomes.
The irony
Not
goes
validated by
unnoticed.
results.
Conditions
Just
in
the
German
cost of
camps
being the
very
person
wildly
she had
decided
decided
to
to be
which
in that
prisoners
one
occupy
impossible
them.
moment.
Soviet
That's what
soldiers
remains.
face starvation and
The
casual
fact
murder.
of the choice.
Western
The weight
prisoners
of it.
face better treatment,
The
governed by
recognition that some
conventions Germany
decisions
still
can't be made
pretends to honor.
strategically.
But the
That
message to
humanity
German
sometimes
civilians
requires
remains
abandoning
consistent.
calculation entirely.
We are civilized.
That 3 lives
They
matter.
are not.
That
As
5
winter deepens
grandchildren
in early
exist.
1945,
That
this
ordinary
narrative
life
becomes even
continues
more
because
important.
someone once decided that
Germany
helping
is
strangers
losing.
was more important than helping
Anyone
herself.
with eyes can see it.
The train left the
Cities
station.
burn.
Carried
Refugees
people to
flood
safety.
westward ahead of Soviet
And
armies.
Marie Duchamp sat on a
Supply
platform
lines
and felt the
collapse.
absence of her papers like a
In this
missing limb
chaos,
and knew that she had
propaganda
finally
becomes
done
one of the
something
few
true.
tools left to maintain
Something
control.
that matched who she was before
If
the war
soldiers
taught her to
believe
think in
surrender means
abstractions,
torture, they will keep fighting.
something that would cost her
If
everything and
civilians
give her
believe
nothing
the enemy
except
will
the
show
knowledge
no
that
mercy,
she had chosen
they will
right.
support total war
Not
until the bitter
strategically
end.
right.
But
Not
propaganda
effectively
only
right.
works when it remains unchallenged.
Just right in the way that makes it
When
possible
people
to
have
live
no
with
way
yourself.
to compare the story they're told
Right in the
with
way
any
that
other
matters
version
when
of
all the
reality.
calculations are finished
And
and
in
all
early
that remains is the
1945,
fact of what you
as her
chose
right
and who you
crumbles,
decided
the
to be.
walls that kept these 2 realities separate begin to crack.